This episode contains graphic content that may be disturbing or traumatizing to some audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Our first reaction when we hear about a murder is to feel something for the victim and their loved ones. Sadness, sympathy, pain, loss. Murder, after all, is the ultimate taking, the ultimate theft. It's robbing an individual of the very space they occupy in our world, stealing their hopes, their dreams, their future plans, their very life and breath. Murder creates a void in the natural order, yet it is also distinctly and increasingly part of the natural order. It's been like that since Cain and Abel. Every murder creates a what if, a hole, a void, an unfilled promise, especially if the victim is young or youngish. Think about how many times you've heard this expression. They had their whole life ahead of them. Whenever we hear the age of a murder victim mentioned in the media, our minds immediately go there. We instantly calculate the depth of the loss in our heads. They had X number of years ahead of them, we think to ourselves. But we also think about what they left behind, about who they left behind. Producers of true crime podcasts know that we do this. They know we attach all that sadness and loss and roll it all up into a big what if. They know we become invested in the victim's story, including the story of what should have been the rest of their lives, had their life not been cut so violently short. So in most podcasts, usually the second episode, we learn all about the victim. It's a way of getting listeners invested in the what if, in the narrative of loss, of the void. But what happens when the victim is flawed, or even worse, some kind of predator that we can't comprehend? It's awkward, isn't it, to have the lines blurred like that? But that's where we find ourselves with the Rose Petal murder. The brutal stabbing of Christina Parcell was accomplished by the violent slashing of a knife, one that sliced into her head and neck area more than 30 times, depriving her of life, of love, and a future. Your first thought? Well, it goes to who was holding the knife. You start to fill in the blanks in your mind, concocting some sort of scenario that makes it all make sense, that aligns what you are seeing into the boxes of good and evil. But this story can't be unpacked that easily. This story can't be explained so conventionally. Why not? Because our victim was found to be capable of despicable, deviant behavior. And not only deviant behavior, but crimes against the most vulnerable and innocent of victims. It is beyond troubling. As news of her murder spread, friends and colleagues of Christina Parcell spoke sweetly of the attractive blonde whose photos are full of those things that defined her, for good and bad. The beloved pet she adored so much that they became the focus of her career as a vet tech, and her pride and joy, her young daughter. These are the parts of her life that those friends and colleagues mentioned most often in the aftermath of her death. Those are the sentiments we want to hear about victims. They were kind and loving. They didn't deserve what happened to them. That way, the forces of good and evil can be neatly defined, and we can go about our lives in some sort of sad state of contentment. Not that we understand the violence that happened, but that we can achieve sympathy for our victim. And again, segregate the good from the evil. But what happens when the victim is no saint? When left behind in her wake is an ugly, insidious trail of unspeakable atrocities committed against the most vulnerable among us, in violation of everything we thought we knew about her? What do we do with the information when the attributes we thought were so wonderful instead warp into something dark and sinister? That is the story of the Rose Petal murder, the untimely death of Christina Parcell. And as we tell that story, especially this chapter, you may start to wonder, who is the real monster? And where are the real monsters in and around us?
Welcome back to FITSFiles, a true crime podcast written and produced by the news team at FITSNews.com. We're the crew that broke the Murdaugh murders, crime and corruption saga, and America's Cheer Incorporated sex abuse scandal wide open. FITSNews is an independent, tenacious media outlet which covers the intersection of crime, justice, politics, and corruption in South Carolina and beyond. I'm your host, Fitz Research Director Jen Wood. I'll be joined on the show by Will Folks, who you just heard from, Dylan Nolan, Callie Lyons, and the rest of our news team as we dive deeper into the stories that we cover on FITSNews.com. That reminds me, all of the articles, documents, sound clips, and other information referenced on this show are available for your review on FITSNews.com. Again, that's FITSNEWS.com. Thanks for tuning in and supporting our work. If you haven't experienced the first 4 parts of this story, I encourage you to go back now and listen to those episodes to get caught up and to get the full effect. By now, you probably know more about Christina Parcell than she ever intended for you to know. You know something about the sexual proclivities she never would have intentionally disclosed in conversation, as I am disclosing with you now. You may even understand that all the evidence kept on her fiancé's phone, computer, and presumably in other private and secret places indicated she believed time was on her side. At the age of 41, Christina was collecting, not destroying evidence. She was operating under the assumption there would be sufficient time to commit these offenses, these incomprehensible deeds, and by whatever means, keep them hidden. It appears as though she never fully considered the possibility that chaos or evil could and would cut her off. We will never know if a tinge of remorse or guilt dropped a vague notion of future repentance and atonement somewhere in her brain. If it did, it was too little, too late, and is now long gone. Instead, Christina's murder revealed so much that she did not want you to know. Perhaps even the elusive reason why she was killed the way she was. Or maybe those who conspired to destroy her found themselves aligned with some dark, but in their mind, righteous destiny as the dominoes began to fall at their nudging, revealing these hideous details that turned a murder investigation into something else. In prior episodes, we have discussed the men in Christina Parcell's life and the man who stands accused of her murder and how they fit together. Now, we take a closer look at the flawed and complex victim in this case and the sordid allegations against her, as we will try to answer one question. Who was Christina Parcell?
In Christina's life, there was clearly a before and after. Everyone has these phases. Before and after graduation, before and after meeting the one, before and after the birth of a child. We mark so many of the phases of our existence through these milestones because, again, that's how our minds make sense of these things. Christina's life was defined by a before and after too. For her, though, it was before and after she became the focus of a deadly obsession. Her life was not always quite so chaotic as it was in the last few years. There was a time when things looked much different. Christina was born in March 1980 and grew up in South Carolina with her sister, Tina, who was 2 years older. They were close. With their rhyming names, it was sisterhood complete. High school friends described Christina as bubbly, a social butterfly, charming and fun. Her sister was a bit more studious, more serious, quieter. Children of the 80s, teens of the 90s, the Parcell girls loved and laughed and tried to figure out who they would be when they grew up. As childhood gave way to young adulthood, the sisters took different paths, but stayed close at heart as sisters do. Christina married twice, and twice it didn't work out. But from all appearances, those relationships were not marred by police reports, allegations of harassment, or threats of violence, not even as they drew to a close. Like most adults, Christina and her first two husbands parted peacefully, if not amicably. Christina filed for her second divorce shortly before Christmas 2009, and she remained in the home owned by her former husband until 2020, covering the duration of her romantic relationship with John Mello. She lived in the house where she became pregnant with and gave birth to her only child, a daughter.
It was at this home in Greer, South Carolina, where neighbors first observed and reported John Mello to the police. They picked up almost immediately on his excessive, obsessive behavior, even before the overwhelmingly intense love bombing of his prey caught its first chill. He was watching her home, disturbing her neighbors, and peering in her windows. Someone saw him, became alarmed, and contacted police. But the act wasn't overtly criminal, which is typical of stalking behaviors, and of John Mello's stalking behaviors in particular. Since Christina wasn't at home at the time, police determined that no charges would be levied against Mello. And so it began, the after, that would forever alter the before of Christina Parcell's life. Christina and John Mello met when she was in her mid-20s. It was the mid-2000s, somewhere between 9/11 and Obama. It happened around the time Prince Charles married Camilla, and Hurricane Katrina pummeled the Gulf Coast. Christina found herself in a state of discontent, failing to launch. In this vulnerable moment, she met Mello at her father's cigar bar. Twice her age, the self-styled music producer was married with 2 school-aged children. As her second attempt at marriage was falling apart, she found herself entangled with a married man who was also otherwise entangled. But not to such an extent it hindered his aggressive takeover of her life in every way he could fathom. He obsessively stalked her, monitored her every move, inflicted distress, and observed her reactions, appearing to be reveling in it. This uncomfortable ugliness was a means of maintaining control that played out in dozens of incident reports covering hundreds of pages. As is common with individuals who find themselves in a troubled relationship, Christina suddenly dropped off the radar. For an extended period of time, she was isolated from friends and family. The erstwhile social butterfly who smiled so easily and laughed so often became noticeably absent from their lives. Whether this was the result of the overwhelming force taking over and consuming her time, her thoughts, and her freedom, we don't know for sure. Maybe it was an attempt, whether it ever became a conscious thought or not, to protect loved ones from the vicious and threatening poison of a person who, once chosen, she could not escape. This was a murky time, documented exclusively in police reports and through the eyes of concerned neighbors. Whatever was going on in the thick of this relationship falls under a dark cloud. In the years to come, Mello would make vague references to Christina's activities as though they were criminal. But then again, he always did. Remember the unfounded allegations and extreme threats? His MO is nothing if not consistent. The fact is that John Mello was married with 2 teenage children when he met Christina, became obsessed with her, and became determined to have a child with her. It's a story old as time. For his part, it's not entirely clear whether Mello wanted badly to have a child or whether having a child was the means to make himself a permanent fixture in Christina's life. Or perhaps ascribing a more sinister motive, he wanted to have a child with Christina in order to create the most deeply wounding ammunition a person can have against a mother. Whatever his aim, that's exactly what happened.
Obsessed. It's an interesting word, but also a romanticized one, as though love is some sort of madness driving passionate people to understandable, forgivable extremes. Think of all the people who got married to that Police song, Every Breath You Take. What were they thinking, right? I mean, since when did love become a stalker anthem? While stalking is certainly a gateway drug to far more serious offenses, there's often very little law enforcement can do about it until something more serious occurs, which, of course, by then is too late. The Victim Connect Resource Center described stalking this way. Stalking is a course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Unlike other crimes that involve a single incident, stalking is a pattern of behavior. It is often made up of individual acts that could, by themselves, seem harmless or non-criminal. Simply put, stalking is the intentional infliction of mental and emotional distress. It is intended to provoke a specific physiological reaction. This goes far beyond saying mean things or expressing dislike. It is a campaign intended to invoke panic and instability. Stalking behavior wears down and weakens its victims, which is exactly what it is intended to do. All the while, the perpetrator is watching, poking, prodding, carefully observing what receives a reaction, what receives the biggest reaction, what causes the most distress, repeating, piling on, seeking maximum impact. And here's the other thing about stalking. It's never been easier to do, and it's getting easier and harder to track with each passing day.
Modern technology affords us so many ways to communicate, including anonymous secret messages, disappearing text from shadow accounts sent via burner devices. These tools are available to everyone. Smartphones, social media, hidden cameras, microscopic audio and video recording devices, GPS, and tracking devices. Modern technology makes it all so easy for a stalker. Before the influx of technological advances, stalkers typically lost interest at a maximum time period of around 18 months. But the internet and related technology has extended the syndrome to the point some stalkers maintain their obsessions for a decade or even longer. While different people react differently to negative or dangerous stimuli, long-term stalking is known to leave rough, boot-sized tread marks, not just impressions or footprints on the sole, even of the strongest targets. It is the result of knowing someone is constantly putting time and energy into tearing you down, undermining you, invalidating your very existence. No wonder stalking is a leading cause of mental illness. Even if the stalking never escalates to violence, the consequences of long-term stalking are serious for victims, causing mental health effects like PTSD and panic disorders, depression, and worse. In viewing the history of the relationship between John Mello and Christina Parcell through police records, one thing is abundantly clear. John Mello was not your average stalker. Mello was relentless and practiced in pure intimidation, pure evil. And this evil came in the form of many different voices and faces who were enticed to commit acts by a master manipulator, a level 5 puppet master who had been honing his skills for decades. By the time Christina was fully captured and contained, the situation was grim. Attempts to end the relationship were thwarted. When she stuck to her guns and stood up for herself, she suffered. He saw to that. Pregnancy became the ultimate entrapment. When she refused to be caged or enslaved, Mello made her life a living hell. The only reprieve was reconciliation, and the relief never lasted. She was still watched, monitored, harassed, and berated into compliance, into submission. Christina's options were not good from the get-go. She was a single mom, and lacking the resources to care for a child can be a daunting proposition. Add to that the kind of trouble she had to have known would ensue, and it's not hard to understand the vicious cycle of breakups and makeups. When, after years of isolation, she emerged to engage with friends and family members, it was with an introduction to the child.
After the birth of his daughter with Christina, Mello filed for divorce from his previous wife, but this was no indication he was freeing himself up for a new life with Christina. A few months later, he asked the same family court judge to grant him sole custody of the toddler. Next, he pursued child support at Christina's expense, stoking a bitter battle that would rage until the day she was murdered, and beyond. At times, Christina conceded, giving up against the insurmountable odds. Then, one evening, she found herself alone again at her father's cigar bar, where she met an older man, another older man, one whom she believed could help her in her fight against John Mello. Bradley Post was a man of means, a man who didn't seem to mind covering the legal bills associated with Christina's messy custody case. But why didn't he mind? Was he genuinely altruistic? Or did he see this as an opportunity, a chance to make Christina beholden to him? In other words, making her trade one malevolent master for another. For years, Christina tried everything she could think of to combat the relentless harassment, seeking the counsel of people who could help, enlisting the assistance of law enforcement, and hiring multiple different attorneys. There didn't seem to be anything anyone could do. The constant battle was exhausting and expensive, a price paid in the kind of terminal heartbreak that's familiar only to those who've experienced desperate worry over the well-being of a child. Mello? He narrowly walked that thin line of legality and plausible deniability. But he was doing everything in his power to push her over the edge. This desperate situation only worsened under the influence of the other man in Christina's life. And as the tally of the legal fees he was covering for her steadily increased, so did her dependence, so did her obligation to him. She was called so many names, accused of every bad thing a woman can be accused of. Slut, prostitute, addict, drug dealer. The list goes on. These unfounded claims were the basis of so many complaints, and the reasons Mello gave the State Department of Social Services and the court for denying her custody. Meanwhile, Christina was making a plan. She went back to college, and she completed the training needed to become a vet tech. She took on a new career, hoping it would provide credibility and job security. This initiative was encouraged and financed by Bradley Post, who by now was fully engaged in the tug-of-war involving Mello, the child, and Christina. At some point, though, it became abundantly clear that Bradley Post, the person Christina was now hopelessly beholden to, was not a benevolent benefactor. He was a pervert, a psychosexual predator. The extent to which he made demands, issued ultimatums, persuaded, coerced, or cajoled Christina is not known. When he convinced her to participate in some of the things best left undescribed, bestiality, buggery, child pornography, and abuse, was she forced? We can never know that whether photographing or filming these things was part of the perversion or potential blackmail, or both.
When she posed nude beside her young daughter and allowed them to be photographed, Christina hardly appeared to be an unwilling participant. Quite the contrary. But was she influenced, drugged, coerced? And if we knew the answer, would it matter? Would it satisfy anything more than our curiosity? Perhaps the most burning question in all this, again, is why? Why would she allow this kind of evidence to exist in a world where she was constantly fighting for custody? It doesn't just defy decency, it defies reason. The images found after Christina's murder at the scene of the crime were not just stored on her and Post's devices. A civil complaint filed in Greenville County Court indicated they were also disseminated to third parties. Even worse, a second civil lawsuit filed indicated another minor victim was involved. In her final summer of life, Christina Parcell and Bradley Post picked up paperwork for a marriage license, but never returned it or exchanged vows. Later that summer, she signed a power of attorney, giving Post the authority to conduct business in her name. But what business? As for the other man in her life, he never let up. And for all the things Mello accused Christina of being, a pedophile was not one of them. He accused her parents and her new partner of that, but not her. Never her. And his allegations against Bradley Post didn't seem to pass muster when you consider his extended absence in Italy at the time all of these things were allegedly happening. When Mello took his daughter overseas with plans of relocating there and keeping her far away from the reach of her mother, Christina sought and obtained the assistance of the State Department to bring her back. And after she managed to get her daughter back, Mello stayed in Italy for months, issuing his typical threats and complaints from afar, but acting in no particular hurry to return home and protect the child from the evils he claimed were all around her. Little did he know. When Christina was murdered, Mello was still in Italy, alibi intact. If he were to have planned it, and many suspect that he did just that, he couldn't have planned it any better. Christina and her daughter were living with her sister Tina. Despite his long-distance antics and the looming storm that would eventually blow John Mello and his wrath back to the States to face charges of custodial interference, they were enjoying an unprecedented level of peace. For the time being, they were beyond his reach, or so it seemed. This is the moment when the real monster, who had been hiding in the shadows the whole time, reared his head. With Christina's brutal stabbing, a Pandora's box of evil deeds was exposed. In the study of homicides, this one is an anomaly, an outlier. It is unusual, to say the least, for a complete stranger to display such passion, the overkill of 31 wounds. And that wouldn't be the only thing that didn't make sense. There are some things about the crime scene you should know before we continue. While cocaine was found at the scene, it is believed the drugs were planted. Supporting this assumption, toxicology reports indicate Christina had no cocaine in her system. The other element left behind by the killer has to do with the rose petals. Blood red roses surrounded Christina's body, but not only petals. The petals had come loose in a fury of what transpired in her final moments, shaken from the dead heads of flowers severed from their stems with a sharp instrument. Scattered petals of red roses and dead heads, but no stems. Where is the story going? What questions should we be focused on as the rose petal murder makes its way through South Carolina's court system? Stay tuned next week for a special roundtable discussion on the status of this truly bizarre, terribly brutal true crime saga. If you appreciate what you hear on this podcast, please support FITSFiles by liking us, submitting a review, and most importantly, subscribing to FITSNews.com, where you will find all of the case files as well as breaking news updates on the Rose Petal murder and other true crime stories. That's FITSNews.com, FITSNEWS.com. One more thing. If you or someone you care for is the victim of stalking and harassment, here is a resource that can help. Phone or text the Victim Connect Resource Center at 1-855-4-VICTIM. Again, that's 1-855-4-VICTIM. Don't suffer alone. Don't suffer any longer.